I'm going to be making a double batch of no-knead bread. And when I was starting to learn, I would watch a lot of videos and they seemed to just miss a few things that I was struggling with. So I was wanting to make a video on how to make no-knead bread and show all the things that it took me a while to learn. Now, this is a double recipe. You do just completely double or triple or whatever else the ingredients. There's no alteration as you go up or down, which there sometimes can be. Now, first of all, I'm right-handed, so you're going to want to scoop in, for a double recipe, 7 cups of flour. Here's what you have to know about working with flour. It likes to get compact a lot, and that can end up meaning that your ratios go off. And I know in a lot of places they end up measuring out their ingredients to avoid that, and that's a really neat idea. I just don't tend to operate that way. So what I'm going to do is do 7 cups this way by just loosening it up and then scooping it in. And then the other thing is, once you learn how to work with the flour and the water, you'll learn what to look for as far as it goes for how much water you need, what's too much water, when you'd actually have overcorrected with the water and need to add more flour. And that's the part for me that was the absolute hardest to learn. So I will try and make that pretty obvious in the video when I do that step. Oopsies. 3 cups. Now, I have my 7 cups of flour. I'm going to need to add my salt and my yeast. I've heard before that if you add the salt and the yeast directly on top of each other, it can have the salt deactivate the yeast. I'm not entirely sure if that's possible, but I also just figure it's not worth taking a chance. So for the doubled recipe, I'm going to do I'm going to do 1 teaspoon of yeast. I used Red Star dry active yeast, and then I had just decanted my salt into one of these old bottles to make scooping it out a little easier. And I'm going to do 2 teaspoons of salt. Great. Now, definitely mix now while your dry ingredients are still just only dry ingredients. Mix the flour bit up with the yeast, mix the flour bit up with the salt. You want to mix everything now because you don't want to be like me, where I added the water without mixing it all, and then I had a huge cup of salt, and no matter what I did, I couldn't reintegrate the salt, and then when I made the bread, it unfortunately didn't taste right because it didn't have enough salt, because I had to take out so much of it. Oops, there we go. Now I'm going to add 3.5 cups of water, which is doubling the recipe. Most recipes will call for warm water. The only thing I found is you have to stay away from hot water. Hot water can kill the yeast. But because this is an 8 to 24-hour rise, if you know you're going to stick more on the 24-hour angle, it doesn't matter if it's cold water. So just make sure whatever you do not to put like scalding hot water on it. It would have been a smart idea if I'd created a well with the flour to add the water in, but I will admit I always forget that step. I do not know why. So I'm just going to mix this around slowly and integrate the water. The one thing you want to watch out for is stirring too vigorously, because you will end up with a huge mess on your counter. I don't really like touching the dough. I hate having to clean it out from underneath my fingernails. Just a pet peeve of mine. So I found a fork and a spoon work well together. My flour is a little bit older, and I found, because I live in a dry climate, that the older the flour is, the more water I seem to have to be adding to it. I think it's drying out little by little as it lives in this climate. I don't know, maybe that's just me not realizing something else, but that's what it seems to be. So this is good because there's very little flour on the bottom. So it means I'm pretty close to being there, and I still have a lot of water in the dough. That is something you want to realize. See how the dough is really wet? You don't want to start adding water to the dough, even if you think it kind of needs it, until you use some of the water that's actually already in the dough. That was one of my problems originally, is that I thought, well, it's not fully integrated yet. I must need more water. But in fact, it was just the fact that I needed to mix it around a little bit more. There. This is good. There's no flour at the bottom that's not integrated. Everything here is mixed up well. Now this is supposed to be more of a wet dough, so it looks like that. And this is done. It's ready to go. If your dough's a little bit drier than this, where when you mix it, it all pulls away from the sides without being sticky, that's fine. It will just affect your amount of time that it takes for the dough to cook, because there will be less water in it, just by a little bit. So keep an eye on it. Or you could add just an absolute splash at most of water if you want to make it sticky. But my concern when I was starting out is that when I did a splash, I would do too much. So just something you want to play around with. You can see from my setup right here, I put everything all the utensils that I'm working with, all the measuring cups that I'm working with on a plate. It's the fastest way for me to clean up because I don't have to clean the counter. I don't have to clean the counter beforehand because I don't want to put something on a potentially dirty counter and pick it up and use it, because then in my mind it's dirty. And then, of course, I have to clean the counter afterwards. Now, of course, I try and keep my counters clean and wash them frequently, but this just is a way to make sure all my cutlery and measuring utensils stay clean while I'm using them, and they don't make my counter dirty. It also makes everything a lot faster. Now, I have to cover this in a plate and leave it in a place where it's not going to get too much air or temperature changes around it. What I'm actually going to do is, because I'm not going to be using my oven in the next 24 hours or 8 to 24 hours, I'm going to just stick this in the oven, not on, just because I don't want a place where the temperature is controlled and there's not a lot of breezes or movement around it. What you can do is a silicone mat on top of it, or you can do a saran wrap piece on top of it. I do a silicone mat on top of it, just like so. And then, because it might move up and let a little bit of air in, I put a plate on top. Now, some people will say when you're letting dough rise that you can put a wet paper towel or a wet tea cloth on top of it. I've not found that to be the case with the doughs that have to rise for 8 to 24 hours, because that's fine. It might be fine if you have to just let your dough rise for 1 to 2 hours, but the 8 to 24, the towel is going to dry off, and then you're going to end up being left with dough that you have to literally like pick off little parts that pretty much just look like this flour. I've let the bread rise for, I would say, almost 20 hours. It kind of got away from me. So, but that's great about this bread. You can leave a large window for when you can actually get to it. We're going to want to pull this bread, or sorry, yeast. Third time's the charm. Dough away from the edges. Pull the dough away from the edges like this. Good. Okay. I'm going to transfer it into these 2 loaf pans. The best way I have found for doing this is first we grease them, and then we use a scale to determine if they each have half and half. And that's what I meant before when I said measuring out the flour. I meant by a scale. I realized that it could have been meant for just a regular measuring cup. So what I like to do, because I always seem to put too much oil, is I first put oil in one of them and then just use that to transfer to the other one. You don't need that much. It's amazing how little you need, and I don't want the bread to get all greasy and gucky. The official word for it. I just want enough to make it sure that it doesn't stick to the sides. There we go. Now, a lot of the times people say to take the dough, to put it onto a floured surface and let it do its second rise. The problem with that is you end up having to clean the second surface, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to take a good amount of the dough here, and I'm sure This is not technically the right way of doing it, but it's always worked for me, and you don't have to mess with it that much, and you don't have to make a bunch of different surfaces dirty, and I like that. There we go. There. I'm just going to start out doing it little bit by little bit. Goodness, that was loud. I'm sorry. And if you're just doing one bread loaf, you can easily just transfer it over directly into the pan. And that would make your life a lot easier instead of having to measure it out. But I like doing it at least 2 loaves when I bake it, because then the input time is only slightly increased, but you get 2 loaves, so your output's drastically increased. And I do let it all cool out, and then I freeze it after slicing it all up. And that's what works for me. I prefer to have it all frozen and pull out the few slices that I want. And that way I can make the bread less frequently, but get the benefit of the homemade bread all the time. So it's pretty clear that I have more in one than the other. But let's just first scrape down the bowl. I just like to get all the last little bits that I can out. You don't have to if you don't want to. Just my preference. And that's the benefit of using a fork and a spoon, is that they seem to get more than just doing one or the other. Here we go. So let's see how this measures out. You can't see that, but it's 2 pounds, 13 ounces. 3 pounds. So it's off by 4 ounces. Oops, that might have been too much. 2 pounds, 15 ounces. 2 pounds, 15 ounces. Perfect. And actually, as you can see, I was rounding. It was 2 pounds, 15 ounces, 14 ounces, 0.7. And they're actually both the exact same. So if you could see that on the camera, they're actually identical. I'm going to just smooth them out a little bit into the corners. I do find that all this kind of evens out in the rise, but I don't want to starting from behind. And you're going to let this rise for 1 to 2 hours. My rule of thumb is usually, well, sometimes I let it rise for 3 because, again, it gets away from you because you're doing something else. Something very important, like in the middle of a good movie, or something very important like work. But 1 to 2 hours is fine. What my rule of thumb is usually is if it's risen to the top of the loaf pan, then that's perfect to go. But obviously, life plays a different role sometimes. Now I'm going to just cover this with the same silicone mat and leave it there. The dough has risen now for almost 2 hours, and I've preheated my oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And I wanted to show you how I calculate the time for cooking an extra loaf. This is the general rule that you would have for if you're cooking one loaf and then you're adding another, or if you're cooking a tray of brownies and then you're adding another. So the recipe normally calls for 45 minutes at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. My bread is always needed 50 minutes at this elevation in the oven that I'm using. So the general rule is you always add 10 to 15% per additional loaf or pan that you're cooking. And so I'm going to take the 10% because I'm already up to the 50 minutes instead of 45. So I'm going to start with 55 minutes of cooking at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. which is why cooking the 2 loaves at once instead of just the 1 loaf, or even 3 loaves at once, is not only a better time investment, it's a better financial investment, because the money you're spending on heating up the oven to 400 degrees Fahrenheit and then running it for, in my case, the original 50 minutes, I only have to run it for 5 more minutes and I've cooked an additional loaf of bread. So that saves my cost of energy. So I'm going to transfer these into the oven, being very careful to not hit my arms against the side. I am speaking from experience. I almost always hit right about here. So I have a scar actually here and here from where I elbowed the oven at about 400 degrees Fahrenheit. And you think it's just a split second, but twice I have scarred myself. So please be careful not to do that when putting these in the oven. And I will update you at the 55-minute mark. The best way to test that I've found if bread is done or not is actually test the bottom. That's going to be the part that's going to be last to finish cooking. In my experience, the top cooks faster. So you take your nail and you flick it against it. Now, you're listening for a dry sound. If it sounds like there's echoing through water, then you need to put it back in. This is the area right here in the center where you might still have some wet sound, but as long as it's not too much and everything else sounds dry, it's going to be okay, because this will dry up as the bread cools. So let's flick it and see what happens. I don't know if the camera's picking it up well enough, but that is sounding wetter. Quite dense and wet. It sounds more like a thud than even just a reverberation through a little bit of water. So what I'm going to do to just try and maybe finish this last bit off is I'm going to drop the temperature down, because I don't want it to get any crustier. It's got a really nice crust on it. I'm going to drop the temperature down to 350 and cook it for another 5 minutes. Now testing this for moisture. There's a really big difference in the sound. This part around here sounds very much like a dry tap. This part in here will still sound more dense, which is why you want to let it cool completely. That will help to finish all the cooking of the bread. That's been the biggest trick that I've learned for making sure I get really good tasting bread is, one, the flick test to flick the bottom. For me, the top never worked well enough, so I would start with the top and then realize, oh, that sounds almost done. Then I checked the bottom and it wasn't done, so I just switched to only checking the bottom. And then to let it cool completely. That, as hard as it is, at least give it, if you really want warm bread, heat it up if you have to, but cool it completely, or cool it as long as you can hold off. The full cooling can take up to an hour, and I will admit I've sliced into the bread before that, but I always try and wait at least 20 minutes before I slice into it. And if I have 2 loaves, I'll always slice into the one that seems like it is further along the process of being complete and less to finish cooking. So there you go. Put it on a cooling rack so that you can let the air ventilate from the bottom. If you leave it in the cooking pans, it can start to have the heat come out of the bread and then actually form condensation in the pan, the baking dish, and it will sweat, essentially, for lack of a better term, and it will make the bread too moist, and it won't taste as good. So let me know if you try this. Let me know how it works out. If you have a bunch of failures, first off, don't get discouraged. It took me a while to fully learn how to do this correctly. It actually took the pandemic for me to learn how to do this correctly, even though I've been trying to bake bread for a really long time. The pandemic was the tip off to hopefully learn how to do it myself. And hopefully some of the tips and tricks that I've shown you can help you speed up your learning process. Here's the finished bread. I've got a heel, which I love, and I've sliced up all the rest of it and put it in freezer safe bags. I'm going to freeze a good portion of it, leaving some out in the fridge, and then as I want more, I'll pull it out of the freezer and put it into the fridge and let it defrost that way, and that way I can have bread for as long as this lasts. Who's to say if I ate 4 pieces yesterday or not? I don't know, not me. If you try it, let me know. If it works out, congratulations. If it doesn't, you are welcome to rant about how annoying and frustrating it can be to start learning how to bake bread. I know what it's like. If you like this video, please like and subscribe for more content like this.